Psalm 8 is a psalm of David. It's unknown as far as its occasion, although I've always imagined David writing it as a shepherd boy sitting out under the night sky, watching the sun rise and set each day. It is classified by genre as a creation hymn, and it is one of 4 primary creation hymns in the Psalter. Like I said, I imagine David looking out at the night sky, and this is what would have greeted him every night in terms of the stars, something that we never see. I say never. It's very rare to see anything like this because of the light pollution due to electrical lighting in the modern world. But this is the view that would have greeted all of humanity up until the widespread use of electricity in the last couple hundred years. So previous to that, this is the night sky that David saw when he wrote this psalm. The millions of stars of the Milky Way scattered across the sky, and it's tragic that this is something that we can no longer experience for the most part. Likewise, David would have, as a shepherd, seen the sunrise and sunset, anxiously looking forward to the sunrise, no doubt, after a long night of counting stars. And every one of these sunsets and sunrising, just a glorious, beautiful experience. And I believe it was these observations of the nighttime, daytime skies that became the inspiration for what I believe is one of the greatest poems ever written. I think Psalm 8 is astounding in terms of a poem, but also in terms of the worldview that it expresses, that is now some 3,000 years old. It is essentially a poetic version of Genesis 1. It is a recounting of creation in song form, and no doubt that it stands above almost all psalms in terms of its significance as a poem and as a worldview and as a prophetic statement of the Messiah Jesus. Let's take a look at the structure of the psalm. Pretty familiar to us. We know that it begins and ends with the same phrase, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." I'm going to label these the A part. They're identical. The next part I'm going to label a B part because its focus is on the heavens. You've set your glory above the heavens, and out of the mouths of babes and infants you've established strength because of your foes to still the enemy and the avenger. And when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars that you've set in place, and so our focus is there on the heavens. And then I'm going to skip down to verses 6 through 8 because here the focus is on the earth. You've given man dominion over the works of your hands. You put everything under his feet, sheep, oxen, beasts of the field, birds, fish, everything. So we have the earth. And I've left out now the central part of the psalm, and that is mankind. What is man that you're mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor. And I want to suggest to you that the structure of this psalm is designed to communicate this very powerful message. What is the purpose and identity of man when it comes to the cosmos? And I think what you see here is a view of that world in poetic form. It begins with Yahweh at the top, and then he dwells in the heavens. He has created man and endowed man with responsibility for the earth. God reigns above all. So this is a picture of creation, and mankind is in the center of creation. And we'll see the significance of that as we unpack this psalm a bit. But this is an expression of what is called the cultural mandate in the book of Genesis, where God identifies the identity of human beings. They're made in the image of God. That's who we are. And he gives us our purpose, and that is to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, rule it, subdue it, manage it, steward it, continue to do the work that I began. This is an incredible statement of the identity and the purpose of mankind. Let's dig a little deeper on the poetry and the language. One of the first things we notice is that this is plural. To this point, we've had psalms that are essentially in the first person, as David makes his laments in the Psalms 3 through 7 rather, those 5 psalms. But here we have our replacing my, reflecting congregational use of this hymn in the opening and closing lines. How majestic is your name. Notice how we had Psalm 3, how many are my foes? Psalm 4, how long will you turn my glory into shame? but now it is how majestic. This marks a turning point. We've had 5 Psalms of lament, Psalms 3 through 7, that have been disorienting. They are expressions of frustration and disappointment and even anger at God because things aren't the way they're supposed to be. Well, along comes Psalm 8, and everything once more is ordered. Once again, everything is set in its right place. And so we would call this a song of orientation, as David reorients us back to ultimate reality. How majestic is your name. You've set your glory above the heavens. The word for glory here is haudka, and it's translated splendor, majesty, or beauty. It's not the most common word for glory, but it is a synonym for glory. Verse 2, you've established strength because of your enemies. A couple of different ways that this has been translated. This is the more literal of the two, established strength, but the NIV says ordained praise. And this comes out of the mouths of babies and infants. In what sense does the speech, the cry of a baby, of an infant, establish strength or bring praise to God? I believe it's because even the cry of a baby has a way of silencing the skeptic by their very being. What we're talking about here is the existence of life. The creation of life is an absolute miracle. And even though we understand more today of how the process works, even at a very fundamental DNA level that David didn't have a clue about, it's still marvelous. It's still a miracle. It's still wonderful. It is still something that only God can do, that is, create life. We think as human beings that we've arrived at the place where we pretty much are masters of our own destiny, and then it comes to matters of life, and we are helpless. We cannot create life. We cannot preserve life. We're limited there. The glory of God is in the creation of life, and the cry of a baby gives witness to that every time. How about verse 4? What is man that you're mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? I've given you the Hebrew words there, and these are poetic words, not the normal words that we use in Hebrew for man. The word for man is ish, but here is enosh. What is enosh that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man, or Ben Adam, Ben son of Adam, that you care for him. I don't really like the NIV 2011 translation of this, which is an attempt to remove gender from this. I think we understand that this is not gender specific here. This is not speaking only of male types of people. It's speaking of mankind. It's speaking of humanity. Who are human beings that you would care. But I don't like to dumb down the poetry. I think we're smart enough to figure out that this is not being sexist here. We're just using the word Enosh and Ben Adam as representatives of all of humanity. And even using the phrase Ben Adam, Son of Man, takes us back to Genesis 1 and 2. Ben Adam. Adam means ground or dirt, son of the earth. Another translation issue in verse 5, you've made him a little lower than the heavenly beings. That's literally Elohim, a little lower than God. Normally we translate Elohim as God, but there are a couple of cases in the Psalms where Elohim definitely refers to angels. Psalm 97, verse 7, Psalm 138, verse 1. And for that reason, and in context, the Septuagint translates Elohim into the Greek as angelos instead of theos, as it normally would. So angels, in fact, this is how the New Testament writers, when they quote this verse, they use the Septuagint. So I'm pretty comfortable saying that you made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, that is the angels, and crowned him with glory. There's that word glory again here. It's a different word. It is the word kabod, which means heaviness, weightiness, and brilliance. So I don't know that there's a distinction that necessarily needs to be made between the glory in verse 1 and the glory in verse 5. They're both synonyms, two different words expressing the vastness of God's glory. In verses 7 and 8, we have a description of the totality of creation. We begin with sheep and oxen, and then we move to the beasts of the field, that is, the wild animals. So we have domesticated and wild animals. Then to the skies, to the birds of the heavens, and then to the water, to the fish of the sea, and whoever swims the paths of the sea. Paths of the sea probably referring to ocean currents, which were understood at that time to drive ships. And so we have here represented the three domains of creation in the Hebrew mindset: water, earth, and sky. We see this trinity of elements throughout the Psalms, water, earth, and sky, and make their first appearance here in Psalm 8. Taking a look through the lens of the authors, a couple of interesting things. First, director of music suggests congregational use. The Gatith, the word Gatith is related to the name of the Philistine city of Gath. So there's some speculation that this is referring to an instrument that comes from that Philistine city, or a Philistine instrument. So if that's the case, David is appropriating an instrument from another culture, a neighboring culture, and using it for the glory of God. So I think that's particularly fascinating, given a possibility of interpreting verse 2 as a reference to Goliath. Of course, David shows up on the scene as a young man defeating the giant Goliath. And I wonder if verse 2, in a sense, could also be referencing that moment where David, in comparison to Goliath, must have felt like a baby, like an infant, and yet God established strength through him and silenced Goliath, even to the point of cutting off his head. So how ironic that David might use a Philistine instrument or a Philistine song form, a gatith, in writing this song that makes a subtle reference to the great Philistine Goliath.